we're going to be going over conditions and loops. In the last video, we went over printing statements and prompting user for input, where when we're printing statements, we can print out a certain text to the terminal, and when we're prompting user for input, we can prompt the user to type in certain input, which will lead to a certain output. So before I go into explaining what a condition and loop is, I'm going to first explain what an IDE is. So an IDE basically stands for Integrated Development Environment, which is basically where all the code is going to be going, and a terminal is basically going to run and execute the code that is going to be typed here. So here we have print out hello world, which is basically what we did in the last video. This is the IDE where we're going to be typing out all our code, and when you run it, this terminal is going to be running this code that we typed in the IDE. So now that we know what an IDE and a terminal is, which is where all the code is going to be typed, let's go first explain that what a condition is. A condition is basically checking whether a certain statement is true or false, and it's going to be checking whether that certain statement is true or false, and checking that certain statement is true, then it's going to be running a certain command. So we can basically make a program where we're going to compare two numbers. First, we're going to prompt the user for input, saying, just like how we did this in the last video, we can declare a variable, and whatever the user types, we can check if that number is greater than, less than, or greater than 5, for example, or if that number is equal to 5. So first, we can prompt a user for input, get a number from user, and this time we have to do it differently because the user has to type in an integer or a number, not a text like hello world. We need the user to type in a number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6, 7, and so on. So this works same way last week where we do input and get a number from user and we store that in variable, except we need to have an int outside of that input get a number from user, which basically means that whatever the user types must be an integer like 1, 2, or 3. Only then will we be able to compare it to 5 and check if it's less than, greater than, or equal to. So now that we have a prompting user for input, we can have the conditions. So here we can check that if n is less than 5, which is basically what the user is going to type. If n is less than 5, then we print the number is less than 5. So this is basically how the conditions work. We have if simply, and we have the statement here. So checking if n is less than 5, and we have a colon. And after that, we need to make sure that we indent. And this command is basically checking. If this condition is true, then it's going to run this statement, which means the number is less than 5. So else if n is greater than 5, which is our next condition that we're saying, the number is greater than 5. So this time, conditions are going to work differently for Python and for else if specifically. So instead of typing else if, it'll be elif, which means else if basically. So basically, if this condition is not true, then it'll be move on to checking, is this condition true? So else if n is greater than 5, then it's going to print out the number is going to be greater than 5. Else, elif, the only condition left is n is equal to 5, and after that we can print out the number is equal to 5. And here in this case we have a equals to, and that's how it basically works in Python and many of the programming languages, is that we have equals saying that a number is equal to this certain number, and that's how it's going to work. Here we have a single equation sign where this is basically gonna, whatever is on the right side, it's gonna assign it and declare it to this variable right here. So now that we run it, now we can have a type of user for input. So we can type in 5 and number is equal to 5. So now let's rerun it and type in 4 instead. 3, see the number is less than 5, 3 is less than 5. Now if we have a number like 7, then the number will be greater than 5. So now we can type, for example, 1209, then it will be greater than 5. So basically, this is how conditions work. And now we're going to be going on to loops. And a loop is basically either infinitely or finitely. You can repeat something a certain amount of times, or either infinitely or finitely. So in this case, we have a for loop in which we can run a certain amount of times, which is basically going to iterate a certain. In this case, we can run a certain variable either finitely or infinitely. So we can have a variable here called I, And here is a range, which means how many times do you want to iterate this. So we can have it, for example, for I in range 5, and then we can simply print out hello world. And what this code is going to do is that it's going to print out hello world 5 times. So that's how a for loop works. A for loop, you can check, we can have a finite iteration, which means repeating a certain amount of times. So in this case, we can have a variable like I, and we have to say in range, which means in this range of 5, print out hello world. So what this is going to do is print hello world 5 times. And this is basically going to print out hello world 5 times. So now, in order to print out something infinitely, we're going to have something called a while loop, and we can have a while true statement. So what this is going to do is while it's going to be true, it's going to print it out forever. And this represents an infinite loop. So now that if we run hello world, it's going to be running forever and infinitely. And those are basically how loops work. So that's how loops and conditions work in Python. So in the next video, we're going to be making use of conditions loops, prompting user for input, printing, and we're going to be going into making more complicated programs.